Hey everyone, today we're going to be taking a look at the different visual properties for Japanese natural whetstones. When we're talking about Japanese stones, this can be one of the most complicated topics to wrap your head around when you're entering into the hobby. There's a lot of different terminology, as we can see, for Japanese natural whetstone visuals, and when you're looking at a stone, it may not just have one, or it could have up to 2, 3, or more of these different visual properties attributed to it. That is because we're not just talking about base color of the stone, but it could be individual attributes, it could be types of inclusion included in the stone as well. I know that many people who collect stones still don't have a perfect grasp of what each of these terminologies mean, so I've put together this presentation as well as a page for your referral on naturalwhetstones.com to try to break down each of the visual properties and give examples for what each of them mean. The goal here is to help you have a better idea of what each of these terms indicate when we're looking at a stone, and hopefully by the end give you a referable skill set so that you can look at a stone, either refer to the list or know it offhand and say, yes, this is a Asagi stone with Namazu and Suji lines. So in the beginning that might be hard to wrap your head around, but either reviewing this video, checking the website page, and looking at stones and trying to identify those properties yourself will get you to a point of understanding what each of the terms mean and how to apply them. So as we first look into these, we can break them down into 3 general groups, the first being base colors of the stones themselves. Typically, stones will have one base color attributed to it. There are certain base colors that could be a duo base color. Maybe it has 2 of them because the stone leans heavily in both directions. Usually, though, when we see a stone named, it will have one base color. The second is some form of additional colors within the stone, patterns within the stone, or terminologies for physical properties the stone can have. And then the last thing we'll look at are what's called inclusions. Usually when the term inclusions is used offhand, it's referring to toxic inclusions. The first thing about toxic inclusions is that it is not harmful to humans. Toxic inclusions indicates toxicity towards the blade or the cutting edge. So there's no human danger with a toxic inclusion, but there is danger to your knife, razor, or tool. However, many of the visual patterns or terminology that we use for Japanese natural whetstones are actually forms of safe inclusion. And when we break down these visual attributes, it is worthwhile to understand that what we're talking about when we say a stone has, for instance, Goma. Goma is a safe inclusion, and many of the different visual properties we apply are actually forms of inclusion. So we will cover each of these categories and what the terms mean, their literal translation, as well as their general use terminology. And we will also take a look at either a picture of the stone if I don't have one of them myself, or if I do have one of them myself, I will take a short video demonstrating the parts of the stone that we're talking about. So it is important up front to have a general disclaimer. I'm not fluent in Japanese, though I make these videos and I help people with the stones and I like to look it up. I do not speak the language fluently. I do spend a good amount of time trying to get a grasp of how to say the different words properly, the pronunciation of them. However, without living and breathing the language, it is inevitable I will make mistakes. So I have tried my best throughout this video, as I always do, to get the either phrasing or pronunciation down. But if you have watched this channel for a while, you know that I, of course, still learn new things and I make my own mistakes. So I'll do my best, and none of the written information is wrong at all. Hopefully the spoken is as close as accurate as I'm humanly capable of making it at this time. Second is that many of these terms, both the term use and the kanji associated with them, are actually informal within the Japanese whetstone industry. Though there is the Kyoto Whetstone Society, it is not really a governing body. No one is saying, here is the definitive list of terms that will or will not be used. You can't use any other terms, or they must only apply to this certain criteria of stone. There are ideas behind what they mean, what they should mean. There are stones that they should imply. However, it does take the individual person to understand the term and try their best to apply it to stones. So it is certainly possible that even after you learn all the terms, you could look at a stone and say, I think this is a Kiita stone. Someone else could look at the stone and go, I don't think it's a Kiita stone. Experience and a good grasp of the different terms can help to avoid that. But at the end of the day, it is an opinionated process, and though we can learn the terms, understand that different people see colors differently. They identify things differently, and a stone in person can look different than after the processing that a photo can have done to it, even just by nature of the camera or the phone itself. So do keep that in mind, that while we try to make this a descriptive process, it is still informal by nature. The last thing is that there is a page where all this information is documented out, also with pictures, the same definitions that we'll go over in the slides here, as well as the copyable kanji terms and the copyable names themselves on naturalwhetstones.com. It will also be the first link in the description of this video for your recall. So though the video may give you your first introduction to many of these terms, you can use that webpage as a reference to strengthen that information, as well as refer to it over time. If you're looking at a stone, you can compare pictures, or if you're trying to identify different kanji, you can look at the kanji that is on the webpage and compare it to the stone or the listing that you're looking at. So the first thing we're going to jump into are the different base colors of the whetstones. Again, this is usually one of the visual attributes that a stone will have, and it should be the majority of the stone's color. Likely, it is also going to heavily indicate what the slurry color will be for the stone itself. There are some times where that can become a little complicated, like Karasu or Torato, where it's not going to always be the same slurry color, but for many of these, the way you're going to determine is it a Kiita stone, is it a Tamagoiro stone, is through checking the slurry and trying to determine what is the base color of that slurry, maybe rather than the base color of the stone. It helps to simplify the process. So keep that in mind as we go through, and I'll reinforce that in areas where it's particularly important. So the first color we're going to discuss today is called aka. Here's the kanji for it, and the general meaning of this term is red. So when we use aka, it can become a little confusing because there is a stone strata called akapin. The reason that it's called akapin is because almost all the stones that come from it are red. However, though, stones can come from other layers. Frequently tomai as well can have aka stones. So when you look at a stone and it's red, you can't immediately jump to the conclusion that it is akapin. You have to dig a little bit deeper. Additionally, this can be confusing because some sellers or some people will call every stone akapin incorrectly. With that said, if you see a red stone and it's labeled as akapin, it's never going to hurt to ask the person who owns the stone or is selling the stone, hey, is this actually the akapin strata stone, or is it an aka red stone that is just being called or guessed as an akapin stone? With that said, akapin stones tend to be very, very soft, and usually you can still tell the difference in their performance between that and a tomai. It's not impossible, but just understand that not every red stone is actually akapin stone. They are all, though, aka stones. When we're referring to this color, it doesn't just mean that the whole stone is red. Usually what it's indicating is deeper reds to red to pink colors throughout the stone in its entirety. This means we can see it in different layers within the stone. It is a fairly prevalent distribution throughout the stone itself, and I would say we're talking, over 25% of the stone is a red or pink color. This is similar to other visual attributes. There are two of them, not base colors, but are other colorings, and we will get to them later, called Iromono and Keppan. It is useful to bring these up now, though, as they can all frequently be misjudged from one another. So when we're talking about Aka stones versus Iromono or versus Keppan, Iromono and Keppan stones will not have red slurry or pink slurry. Those stones will come up typically as a tan or a gray. So if you have a stone that has a lot of red, a lot of pink in it, and you're curious, is this an Aka base color or is this an Iromono or Keppan, attribute stone? If the slurry is coming up pink or red, you can know, okay, this is an Aka stone. It's got the Aka base color. In this case, I do not have an Aka stone. I do have Iromono and Keppan stones, but none of them come up that pink-red slurry that we're looking for. So Shinichi Watanabe has gracefully allowed me to use one of his pictures for us to take a look at what a pretty standard-looking Aka pin stone looks like. So here we have it. We can see that we have a lot of red on one end, except throughout the stone we can see bandings of pink and deeper reds as well. Some additional attributes that kind of help to give it away is we can see on the sides of the stone in the layering that there are also whole layers that are likely that deep red color. So when this stone is slurried, he has confirmed, it comes up a pinkish red. And as such, right, we can visually see maybe it's a mix between a tan or yellow stone and Aka pin, or I'm sorry, not Aka pin, Aka, see, even I did it, Aka stone. It could be considered kind of both base colors. However, because it slurries pink or red, it is an Aka base color stone. All right, moving on to our next color, we're going to cover Asagi. Asagi has a very wide range of meanings, and there are 3 different kanjis combinations that can be commonly attributed to it. Generally, when we use the word Asagi, it is referring to either light-colored indigo stones or light yellow stones. In either case, though, the core attribute that the light indigo or light yellow is actually sharing is what we would generally refer to as gray. This very wide range compared to other Japanese whetstones comes from a lack of understanding, even in Japanese, as to the origin of the word. Some people will think that Asagi, or some people do think that Asagi comes from the word indigo or light blue as an origin, and other people think it refers to the setting sun or like afternoon mist. In that case, obviously you can see that one is a very light bluish gray. The other is going to be a light yellow, which is what gives us that spectrum of use. When we're really talking about it with whetstones, it does generally mean gray. It's going to be gray that could be light blue leaning. It could be gray that's dark yellow or light yellow leaning. But the stone will not be very colored as yellow, very colored as blue, and when you slurry it, it's going to come up as a gray color. So again, we get back to that concept that slurry can help us firmly identify what the base color is, maybe rather than the tinted leaning of the stone itself. Generally, we can kind of consider Asagi to be a catch-all term for stones that do not fit into any of the other categories. All the other categories are much more clear as to what they are indicating or the general color they're attempting to portray. And if it does not fit cleanly into one of those other colors, it probably is a grayish leaning tinted stone, and as such, it can fall within Asagi. I've seen Asagi that are bluish, greenish, yellowish, and even maybe sometimes a little reddish. So it can be either of those ways, and again, check that base color or that slurry color to help us identify what really the base color is going to be. There is actually 2 different hex codes for Asagi to kind of further reinforce this point that it can be kind of blue or kind of yellow. So if you're really curious, you can put those hex colors into Google and see the 2 different versions of Asagi and kind of extrapolate from there. Both of the hex colors are pretty vibrant versus in whetstones, it's not really indicating a vibrant version of those colors. It's indicating kind of like a tint to gray of those colors, but still helps you get the point if you want to take a look at those colors. For Asagi, I do have some stones that have at least portions of their stone makeup as Asagi. and they do slurry gray, so we would call them Asagi stones. We'll go ahead and take a look at those now, and then come back to our presentation. For our Asagi examples here, we only have 2. I don't have many Asagi stones to pull from, but we can use this as an example. Sorry about the drops of water. So this area, this light gray, is what we would call Asagi. Asagi doesn't actually mean gray. It's a form of like very light indigo, essentially. If there's a lot of debate about what exactly Asagi means, you can look it up. It's a hex color. It's available, and you can see exactly what they're talking about. This is Asagi. Now, when we refer to it in Japanese whetstones, it can have that very large range as I covered in this slide. But in this case, this is fairly classic colored Asagi, just a very light version of it. So when we're looking at this stone, we're going to ignore this coloration over here. This has a name that we'll cover later, as well as this coloration here. Asagi is just this base stone area, so not the freckling or not the black dots, just the gray color within the stone here. And these stones are related. I mean, they're from the same cut of stone, but we can take a look here at a second example. This one obviously has a lot more of this orange, coloring we'll cover later, but here we still have Asagi, and we would still call this stone an Asagi based color because even though it has all of this additional color, when we slurry it, it comes up gray. Again, that like gray to very light, blue, gray, green color, but primarily gray. So since it slurries gray still, we would not say it's a different base color. So frequently when you're identifying stones, if you're identifying it for yourself, you're going to have to slurry it to make sure you understand what it is. All right, now that we've finished covering Asagi, we're going to move on to our next base color called Karasu. Here we have the kanji and the general meaning of the term, which indicates crow. And really what it's actually indicating is a kind of like a metaphor or a representation of crows flying on a darkened sky. Usually this means that the stone has blue, black, and white patterning to it within the stone's actual physical makeup, and there will be dark, again, that dark blue or black blotches on the stone itself, which are over a lighter base color. Usually, this comes from the Isa layer of the main strata that we find stones, Awasedo stones typically coming from out of Kyoto. There are some stones that are Karasu and are not Isa layered, but they're incredibly rare. Rare to the point that, you have a 99% plus chance of any Karasu stone being an Isa layered origin. So, generally speaking, unless if the stone comes from a reputable vendor and is specifically labeled as Karasu Tomai, Karasu Suida, you can look at a Karasu stone and go, this is an Isa layer stone. When we're dealing with these Karasu stones, care must be taken to check that the crow-like dark splotches on the stone itself are not toxic. These stones can form in a manner where the light coloring and the dark coloring are different hardnesses, and in a way that will be toxic to a blade as you wear the stone, because you will have different areas of the stone providing different grit and different hardness. You will not get an even finish out of that stone. So very commonly when this is the case, the dark splotches are what we call like scratchy, because they are so hard or they have different grit composition. So if you're looking for a Karasu stone, always make sure that the person verifies that the crow spots are not toxic or scratchy. Additionally, these type of stones have a large abundance of lines, of inclusion lines in them. Usually, of course there are ones without it, but by far the average Karasu stone will have mineral lines within the stone, kind of in accordance with having more lines than other types of stone. It is more likely that those lines could be toxic. So if you see a stone with a lot of lines, always double check with the person who has it, who you're getting it from, that the lines are not toxic and cannot be felt by the blade. Generally speaking, light Karasu stones that are free of lines are very highly prized and as such are very valuable. This is primarily for their visual attribute. Karasu itself, very nice ones, even don't come with any particular performance benefit, but because the pattern itself is rather rare, the ISO layer is a smaller strata layer, there's not many of the stones, and then if it has no lines and it's light, it likely means that there are no toxic, no scratchy parts to the stone. They are very prized stones. So in this case, I do not have a Karasu stone worth showing. So Shinichi has once again provided a picture for us to take a look at here of a fairly standard looking Karasu stone. In this case, you can see that if it did not have these dark splotches, we probably would call this an Asagi stone. But we do have those dark splotches, and though they might not always look like crow, you get the abstract concept it's referring to. So we have these dark splotches against the light background, and you can see even in this stone, because it's a fairly typical example, we do have a lot of lines, mineral lines running through the stone. In this case, it looks pretty good because none of the lines are particularly dark. Usually the darker the lines, the more likely it's going to cause you a problem. However, any of these lines could still be toxic, and the vendor would have to test them all for you. Additionally, it's always worthwhile to note that while these lines might not be toxic now, later on within the stone itself, there's always a probable chance that the line could become toxic. So keep that in mind as you are considering a Karasu stone. There's always a little bit of risk that goes into it, and already you are kind of purposefully looking at a stone that is prioritizing some level of visual attribute over performance. You're taking a little bit of a risk for that very particular and pretty pattern. So moving on to our next color, we're going to cover Kiita. Here's the kanji for Kiita, and the meaning is yellow plate. So these stones are typically a vibrant to darker yellow that's firmly throughout the stone itself. And again, we should see that yellow color come out when the stone is slurried. Usually, Kiita stones have a reputation for being on the softer side of things. It is perfectly possible to find a Kiita stone that is very hard, but on average, they're going to be softer than Asagi stones or other colored stones. With that said, though, it's always important to put the disclaimer out there that you should check every natural whetstone before you buy one. You should not get a Kiita stone and assume it's going to perform like another Kiita stone. When you're talking statistics, it does not indicate specific performance for one specimen. It's just telling you, if you bought 30 Kiita stones, that more of those will be soft than if you bought 30 Asagi stones. Once you take the individual specimens out, that is probably true. So keep that in mind. They are likely to be softer, but it's not a firm rule. Also, Kiita can look very similar to a different base color called Tamagoiro. Sometimes even vendors will kind of lump them into one broader category. For instance, I do know that Watanabe does that. He has one page that is both Kiita and Tamagoiro stones, though on the page he does delineate between the two. We will get into what Tamagoiro is in a little bit, but this is where you are going to want to check the slurry itself. If the slurry comes up yellow, you have a Kiita color. If it comes up tannish, it's going to be Tamagoiro. Now, of course, when you're talking about tan to yellow, it's a spectrum, it's not a binary, and as such, you as the person or the vendor is going to have to make a judgment call for those in between stones, where it's leaning yellow, but it's a tan stone, right? And in those cases, I just suggest people look at the slurry and say, right, is it more yellow than tan? Is it more tan than yellow? That will lead you to your choice. But of course, there are also some Kiita stones that are super Kiita, right? They're extremely yellow stones, and there's no doubt that they are yellow and nothing else. Generally speaking, Kiita stones are very sought after in Japan and are considered the kind of like premier color of stone. It's what the average person will want there. As such, this does translate into Kiita stones tending to fetch a higher price. This comes back to two different reasons. The first being that they are on average a little softer, and most people want a little bit softer, a little bit faster of a stone. And then the second is that those bright Kiita yellow colored stones do allow you to see very clearly the different particles within swarf that you generate, the metal that you shave off of the blade, how much you've cut, how it's cutting, and you can manage the slurry on a Kiita stone very easily because the difference between yellow and gray or dark black, even the steel, is stark. So you can really get an idea of how much you've cut, how exhausted your slurry is, whereas a gray stone to black is, right, not as easily understood the difference of. So those are kind of the two reasons why Kiita tends to fetch a higher price. And obviously many people probably just think they're pretty, they're beautiful stones, and that plays into the price as well. So I do have some Kiita stones, and we'll go ahead and take a look at a video of that and then return to our presentation. Here are Kiita examples. This is the most common color associated with Kiita. It's kind of like the classic Kiita, if you want to call it that. It's a very yellow, very bright, and sometimes they can even verge a little on orange. Let's go ahead and get it wet. And the slurry also comes up incredibly yellow. So from here, we have the more middle ground Kiita stones. Kiita can be very difficult to tell apart from Tamagoiro. And here is one that we would also consider to be Kiita. You can see it's a lighter tan color. When you're dealing with Tamagoiro or Kiita, you have to determine based on visual presentation of the stone, as well as the slurry, whether or not it is like a mottled egg colored, light mottled egg color, or if it is actually yellow. So in this case, we'll go ahead and slurry the stone. This one does become a little bit more easy to identify once it's wet, but particularly when we generate slurry from it, it'll come up as a light to medium yellow. So it is a Kiita stone. Our next stone would also be considered Kiita. The binder is also a lighter yellow to tan, so we have to make that same judgment when we look at it wet, and also when we slurry it. Now, this stone has other colors in it as well. That does not necessarily not make it a Kiita. It just means it has more attributes than just a Kiita. So this red and other coloring can be classified as other items. So this base color is what we're looking for, and the base color we would still, in this case, consider it Kiita, and it does come up as yellow. Now our last stone here is right on the edge of whether or not it is Kiita or whether it is a different color. Visually, you could identify it as maybe Asagi, Kiita, or Tamagoiro. So let's go ahead and get it wet. You can see wet though, it does definitely lean tan, but we still have those streaks in it, and the slurry of it definitely comes up a light tan yellow. Now, this is where the judgment call for the person comes up. Whether you classify this as Kiita or not, it can be difficult unless if you have it in hand. So it's not like this stone where there's no other option to call it. This one does take a little bit of judgment as the person who has it in front of them. All right, next up, we're going to take a look at the Kuro base color. Here's our kanji, and the meaning of it is black. Generally speaking, you're going to see this base color in Tsushima Nagara stones. There are not many whetstones from Japan that we would consider a Kuro base color. Maybe they have black spots, which can be one terminology, or they're Karasu, which is a different terminology. But when we say Kuro, it means that the slurry comes up a dark gray or black, and the stone itself looks pretty much black. There are a version of stone that comes from Shubudani and Uzuku that are both black in color, and usually they have like kind of a splotchy black-gray pattern to them, which are really the only other ones you see besides Tsushima. And I also believe Taniyama has a black stone, a dark gray black stone that comes out of it that's very hard, and Bushu, I think I say that right, Bushu, is also a black stone that looks a lot like Tsushima Nagara. Generally speaking, this is a much more rare color, and it's not very sought after because, of course, black-gray slurry does not really allow you to see the swarf that you're generating well at all. Can't really tell how fast it's cutting. In this case, though, I do have a Kuro base stone, and we'll take a look at a video of that now and return to the presentation. All right, for our base color of Kuro, we have an example here of a Tsushima Nagara. You can already see it's a very dark gray, but wet. There's no doubt that is anything but Kuro, or black. In this case, it's a very pure Kuro, so we have almost no other qualities we could accidentally mistake for in the stone. There are not many Kuro stones outside of the Tsushima Nagara, but there is some that come out of Shobudani and some that come out of Uzuku, which are commonly very hard stones, not like the Tsushima. All right, next up, we're going to take a look at Mizu Asagi. Here is the kanji for Mizu Asagi, and generally the meaning of this is light blue water. You can see, of course, that it has Asagi in the name, so it's somewhat related to it, but the Mizu attribute is what is bringing the true bluer or light water color to the equation. This can also be referred to as just Mizu and leave the Asagi out, though that's a pretty rare way to refer to it. You do see it come up now and again. As the meaning implies, it does indicate a stone that is blue-gray in color, reminiscent of shallow ocean water, but in this case it has a definitive blue tint to it. It's not like gray with a little bit of blue. It's like that's a blue whetstone. There's also possibility where the stone can come out a little greenish, but if it's a turquoise, right, a greenish blue, it would still be Mizu Asagi. These are usually formed where the Asagi and Kiita layers are kind of combining and then compressed very heavily. Typically, these stones do have a higher percentage of grit in them, which is what is playing a little bit into the way the coloring is formed, and due to that higher percentage of grit, they're also very typically harder, more compressed stones. A lot of Mizu Asagi make very good razor stones, but again, standard disclaimer, you cannot draw a definitive conclusion of how the whetstone will perform from the color. We can just talk statistics. So they are good stones to start looking at if you want a razor finisher or that very hard stone, but you still need to get information from the seller about the stone. I do have some Mizu Asagi stones, so let's take a look at a video at that, and then we'll return to the presentation. For our Mizu Asagi examples, we have two of them. Here's one. It is a Nakayama. You can see, unfortunately, we still have our stone here still wet, but it is much more blue-gray in color, and in person that is even more significant than probably on the camera. And we can go ahead and wet it and see what it looks like. And it kind of maintains that blue. So you're looking for something that looks, like a very light gray with a heavy blue attribute that leans it in that direction. Sometimes this can even come off a little bit green, but it has to have that tinting that isn't just a neutral gray. Our second Mizu Asagi, I think, is actually even a better example of Mizu Asagi. This is an Iwatani. Let's go ahead and take a look at it wet. And you can see while it has maybe a little bit of freckling of regular gray, it's definitely a blue or green leaning stone. Now again, when we're talking about base color, we're not talking about the freckling. We're not talking about the black dots. We're not talking about the pattern in it that makes it look not just like a flat color. We're just talking about the color of the stone. Slurry needs to come up whitish blue. Same with the Nakayama. So both of these are Mizu Asagi stones. Our next base color we'll be covering is called Shiro. Here's our kanji for it, and the meaning of Shiro is white. In this case, it is used to refer, of course, to the white base color of the whetstone itself. There is a chance for Shiro stones to also include other colors, but generally, once again, we're returning to that maybe a larger portion of the stone than other areas has white in it, and the slurry itself should come up white. I do have some stones that are pretty close to Shiro, but I did not feel like it was close enough for us to really consider it a pure Shiro stone. So once again, Shinichi has allowed us to use a stone that is a classic example of a Shiro stone as an example. So it kind of goes without having to explain it. It is a very white whetstone, and there's no doubt that that slurry from the stone is going to come up that white base color. A stone does not have to be this white to be considered a Shiro stone. Often they will have more of the brown lines through it, or they could have some gray spots in it as well. But if the majority of the stone is white and it comes up as that white slurry, you have a Shiro stone. So our next color, for base color we're going to cover is Tamagoiro. Here's the kanji for it, and the meaning of this is generally egg colored. So for these stones, they're going to, again, look maybe a little Kiita-like, but they're going to be a less bright yellow. And the yellow will be tan leaning. It could even be technically like a light brownish egg color. The best way to think of this are not white eggs, but the spectrum of brown eggs, how they can be very light brown to very darker brown. Tamagoiro can kind of fit within that range. Can be really difficult to tell them apart, but we do go back to that slurry. If the slurry is like a tan that's yellow leaning, we can probably call it a Tamagoiro stone, whereas again, if it's yellow tan leaning or just yellow, we would call it a Kiita stone. Similar to Kiita, Tamagoiro stones do tend to be fairly soft stones on average, but it is average. Check the stone before you make the assumption. I do have some Tamagoiro stones, so we'll take a look at them on video, and we'll come back to our presentation afterwards. So Tamagoiro, which means egg-colored or eggshell-colored, represents a light tan, as was covered in the slide. It's very similar to Kiita, and many vendors will lump them together. So this stone is pretty much all over the place. We've got some Asagi stripes. We've definitely got some Kiita areas, and then we've got a lot of in between. Now, that mixture can definitely be considered a mottled color, which can also, it can be one of the parts of Tamagoiro. And when we slurry this, it's going to come up as a light brown, not very yellow. So this is, you can kind of consider Tamagoiro as a bridge between Asagi and Kiita. So if you have a stone that kind of fits firmly between the two, that's what you're looking at. So here is a pretty good and classic example of Tamagoiro, but we have 3 others to also take a look at. And again, even though this banding in the stone may play into it being a Tamagoiro stone, this banding is not Tamagoiro. We're only talking about the base color, the cumulative effects of all the colors in it that are just the color of the stone. So next we have a different Haka Tamagoiro. You can see now, maybe when we hold it over our Kiita stones, this one at first glance might have been considered Kiita, but when we wet it, we can see it darkens up quite a bit. And when we slurry it, again, it's a like light brown color rather than a yellow color. You can also get an idea of that better by putting it on white paper, right? Slurry something and then put it on some paper towel or something. That'll give you an idea. So we have another Tamagoiro stone. Now once again, these patterns in it, this freckling, not Tamagoiro, just the base color. Third stone here is an Iwatani. We got a similar thing. It could have been a Kiita, but once we wet it, and also if we slurry it, we can tell it doesn't brighten up, it darkens down. And you can also tell it has, these other colors that are going to impact its slurry into a darker brown. This red, these lines, not Tamagoiro properties. We're just talking about the majority of the base stone color and what the slurry will come up. And our last Tamagoiro stone here is another Haka. This one you can almost tell just looking at it that it's going to be Tamagoiro. And if we wet it, Once again, you can see it did not brighten up, darkened down, but it's definitely not gray, right? It's somewhere in between those two, and it's that light tan, brown leaning color. All right. That is Tamagoiro. All right, so we are on to our last base color, which is called Torato. Here we have the kanji for it, and the meaning of Torato is tiger whetstone. When we're referring to a Torato stone, it is going to be red with a banded attribute of orange and white running throughout the stone, obviously like a tiger. These are most commonly either Amakusa stones or Natsuya stones. Additionally, you may see these referred to as Amakusa Aka Torato, so Amakusa red striped, or Natsuya Aka Torato, Natsuya red striped, but they can also leave the Aka out. Whether or not that's correct or not, you can kind of determine. Generally speaking, I would not use that terminology because I think that they're orange colored. They're not red colored. And as such, I would just call them Amakusa Torato or Natsuya Torato stones. Generally speaking, you're not going to find a Torato stone outside of one of those two. Usually those attributes, if it's not an Amakusa or a Natsuya, is actually not the base color. It's some other color. But when you're looking at a Torato stone, it should not be wood-like banding. It should be wavy type banding. And the base stone slurry color should come up orange, not red or tan, but definitely orange. So I do have a Torato stone, and we'll take a look at that. And when we come back to the presentation, we'll move on to the next type of visual attribute. All right, here's our example for Torato. This, as covered in the slide, it's going to look like stripes of a tiger on a stone. And when you slurry this, it's going to come up red. So if you have this color, some of these patterns, some of these stripes on a stone, but it comes up white or it only encompasses part of the stone. It's actually a different property, and that's covered later, likely Kan. So in this case, though, we see that the coloration goes through the entire stone, and if I was to slurry it, it would come up that orange-red color, so it is a Torato stone. And if we wet it down, it's a very thirsty stone, so we're going to need some more water than that. Here's what we're working with. This is a Natsuya, and the striped versions are obviously Torato, and the other common Torato stone is an Amakusa. So we've covered all the different base stone colors that you're going to usually see in a stone. So if all of the visual attributes of the stone are labeled, the stone will usually have a mine name like Nakayama or Iwatani, a strata name like Tomai or Suida, and then a base color. So it could be that Kiita or Asagi, all the colors that we just covered. So once you get the base color down, there's a chance that it has other colors within it or patterns within it that are formations of the stone themselves, not inclusions, not a foreign mineral or some other substance causing a visual look, but these would be actual different colors of the stone themselves. It could be from geothermal changes, it could be from the sediment being of a different color when they mix together in the ground before compression and being heated. So we will go through these different terms. Some of them are also physical attributes of the stone itself, which we can visually identify. So let's get on to it. Our first one is called Gotogi. This is the kanji for it, and Gotogi can have a couple different meanings, but the best terminology for it is usually stratified, though layered is also kind of an option for what it means. So this does refer to the visual layering or stratification of the stone itself, and usually this is seen on the side of whetstones. Usually Awasedo stones have that sedimentary layering that we would call Gotogi. The visual information is, coming from those different layers of silt that are piled on top of one another, usually from either ocean currents lapping together or removing sedimentary layers, or it could be volcanic tuff. It could be different layers of volcanic ash or runoff that are stacking on top of each other over time and then pressed together. When Gotogi is on the sharpening surface of the stone, so rather than on the side of the whetstone, it's on the top that we actually use the knife on, it is referred to as Masame. So there is a certain name for that, and we will also show an example of that later. But for now, we'll take a look at Gotogi and a few different stones, and then we'll come back to our presentation. Here are our examples for Gotogi. We have a few of them in here, but I'll pick out the two that are the most easily seen, which are both Suida. Suida stones very commonly have pronounced Gotogi because you see that it has these lines. So that layering that we can identify as in the stone is Gotogi, and it's Gotogi if it's on the side of the stone. So let's take a look at our second example here, which is also a Suida stone. This one has very pronounced Gotogi. 1 layer, 2 layer, 3 layer, 4 layer, etc. So those different layers, that visual layering quality is called Gotogi. Our next visual attribute to cover is called Habutae. Here's the kanji for it, and this can be kind of either referred to as rice cake or silk weave. Silk weave is the more literal version, and rice cake is the more figurative version of what the term is referring to. So when we use this term, though, in a whetstone, we're talking about something a stone that is extremely white and almost always some form of sweetest stone that has a silky texture to its surface. About how the white interplays and is bright or a tiny bit reflective on the surface. Not like a metal, but like a sheen. That's a better way of saying it. It is a very rare stone. They're considered very pure and very good performers, and they are indeed very sought after for those qualities. In this case, I do not have an Habutae stone, so once again, Shinichi has given us a picture to take a look at what these stones can look like. So here we have the Habutae stone. You can see it kind of has a Shiro quality to it, but it's a little interwoven with other elements. Additionally, if you were to hold the stone and look at it in the light with a little bit of light reflection, it is going to have a larger than normal sheen within its surface than other whetstones. Many Japanese whetstones still have that sheen, but this should have a thorough sheen running throughout the stone. Also indicating, high performance is probably going to cut fast because it has a lot of natural grit in it. On to our next visual attribute. It is Iromono. Here's the kanji for it, and the terminology more literally is colorful fabric, though you will also frequently hear it referred to as colorful laundry. Obviously, they're related. This characteristic is going to be different types of colors throughout the stone itself. That could be reds or pinks, but also violets, greens, anything that is different than the base stone itself in a splash of color could likely be considered Iromono, but it's usually colorful, right? Not splashes of gray. It's going to be splashes of those vibrant elements. So this is frequently seen in softer Kiita stones or softer Tamagoiro stones. Once again, though, you can find Iromono stones that are harder, but statistically speaking, most Iromono stones are leaning on the soft side of things. Again, as we kind of covered in the base color section, this is not to be confused with Aka or with Keppan, where they have different elements. Aka is red right throughout the stone itself. It's going to pull up pink slurry because there's so much red in the stone. Iromono usually does not affect the slurry of the stone. It'll usually come up tan or yellow, regardless of the fact that the stone has these interwoven colors in it. And Keppan is going to be only red colored. We will get to that in a little bit. So I do have some Iromono stones for us to take a look at. We'll switch over to the videos and then get back to our presentation afterwards. Iromono we have two different examples of. We have other stones that are pretty close to Iromono, but these are without a doubt going to qualify. Usually we need to see a splash of at least 2 different colors, one being red and then another being a different color. So I'm hoping this will show up the differences in the colors in this, but we do have red and pink, and there's a little bit of purple in there, but that could be hard to see. So this would be a Iromono stone. Now we're not talking about the base coloring, we're talking about this additional coloring on top, and frequently that will not show up in the slurry. Here's our second Iromono stone. Same thing as before. Not necessarily talking about the base coloring, but the additional colors on top of it. I think this one will be easier to see the relevant splashes. We have some green, we have red, there's purple here, violet purple here. So a whole different slew of colors. So this stone is a Iromono stone. Our next visual attribute to cover is called Kakishibu. This is the kanji for it, and the meaning is generally that of persimmon juice, but that is the more literal translation. What it's actually referring to is a dyeing method for fabric or paper, where you use fermented persimmon juice to create a certain type of bubbly circular pattern on the material. In this case, when we're talking about stones, it has a similar look to that, where it might have a whitish or light background color with circular round blotches on the stone itself. Very frequently, they are a light dark or a dark brown color. It is also one that looks a lot like where it might have droplets of water standing on the surface of the stone. Our example here does do a good job of showing you both the blotchy version of the circular or rounds patterns, as well as maybe like the standing water version of it. Usually, Kakishibu stones are Suida stones, but there are, I'm sure, some oddities out there that are not Suida stone varieties. And once again, Shinichi has given us our picture here to take a look at it. As you can see, they're very interesting stones. They can come with a wide variety of color to them, and this stone in particular has a dramatic range of Kakishibu elements to it. And, you know, they are very pretty stones, but do not really indicate any performance quality in the stone itself. It is purely a visual attribute alone. So our next visual attribute to cover is called kan. Here's the kanji for it, and the reference is ring roll. This is a visual pattern in the stone that looks like rings of a tree. Now, there are actually 2 other terminologies that also mimic patterns that come from wood or rings in a tree. So this can get a little confusing when we're trying to figure out which one is which. In this form, though, the rings run across the stone as though they're a bisection of the wood. They will not try to make a circular pattern. They will not look like a complete log circle or anything like that. They're more lines that will run directly across. So you get that tree look stratification, but you don't get the like wood flow to the stone itself. The other ones that this can be a little confused with is Mokume, Nenrin Hada, Torato, all have the wood-like visual banding to it. So you have to be a little bit more particular when you're trying to figure out which one it is to pay attention to the individual attributes of it. Torato, which we've covered already, is going to look like a tiger stripe. It's not going to be a very defined straight line in its layering, and the stone will likely be very orange in color. We do have a kan stone to take a look at visually, so we'll switch over to the video and then come back to our presentation afterwards. I only have one example of a kan stone. This is it. It is different than Torato base color because it does not come up red. It does not fully encompass the stone, and the stripes are much thinner. So it looks much more like wood than tiger stripes if we wet it down. Now, there are a few different topics of what looks like wood, and they can be hard to distinguish. This is kan and not any of the others because this does not make any circles, and it runs the length of the stone. There's no curvature or anything in it, so we would identify this as kan, visual quality. And again, this is these lines, not necessarily the base color of the stone. Interestingly enough, the stone comes up as a white slurry color, so maybe it would be considered a Shiro, hard to say. Our next visual attribute to cover is called Kawa. Here we have the kanji for it, and the meaning does not literally translate into anything, but the use of the word indicates the skin of the whetstone itself, and this is the hard, natural outer surface of the stone. Usually it's what the stone would look like in the mine or when it's pulled from the surface, and it's going to have a rough edge, of course, on it, and usually be of a harder, different material than the stone within. So you would not flatten out a kawa surface and use it. You would have to chop the kawa off because it is not suitable for being used as a whetstone. Usually the kawa is going to be harder than the rest of the stone itself, or grittier is also a possibility for this. I do have some stones with kawa, though most of them are sealed behind lacquer, so we'll take a look at that in the video and then come back to our presentation. We have a lot of different examples of kawa we can go through, but I only have two which are not sealed, so we'll take a look at those first. This rough layering is technically kawa, but this one's been mostly chiseled off. This is a far better example of what kawa usually looks like. You can see that we have that rough skin of the stone. It's different than this softer one that has been exposed. This is what the stone looked like before, of course, this piece was worked out. Usually, when you see kawa in stones, it is on the back side of the stone. And usually it's sealed if you are going to soak the stone. So this is kawa as well. So is this one. Interestingly enough, some Isa strata stones can have kawa that look almost exactly like the stone itself. So even though this looks like it was worked, it was just flattened, but the kawa was the same color as the stone itself. And this is a second example, which has also been flattened, but you can still see elements of the kawa. Fortunately, after I seal it, it's a lot harder to see that, but all of these were actually like a green, these pockets were a green color, and that's what the stone looked like before. But usually, kawa is going to look like this. Our next attribute to cover is called Keppan. Here's the kanji for it, and this generally means blood spots. When we're talking about it for stones, this is going to be red swirls or blotches on the stone itself. Usually they're going to look like pooled blood or running blood on the stone, so some form of liquid. So this can be confused, of course, with aka or Iromono. There are differences, though. It's not going to be as prevalent throughout the stone as to affect the slurry as aka. Usually it's going to also have that particular running water look to it, versus aka will just be more running through the stone without the visual pattern. And then Iromono will be many different colors, whereas Keppan, blood spots, should be specifically red. Maybe not even pink, just a red color within the stone that has that running pattern. So I do have one Keppan stone, and we'll go ahead and take a look at it. Keppan I only have one example of. So mostly dry. It's going to be these red areas, which will come out a lot more when we wet it. Now, for the stone to be Keppan, the red areas need to have this this flow look to them, where it looks like they're pooling. Our next visual attribute is called Kiiro. Here's the kanji for it, and the meaning is generally yellow, but it kind of leans or indicates amber. And when we use the word Kiiro, it's not to refer to the entire whetstone, obviously. At this point, we have Kiita, we have Tamagoiro. Those are going to be the yellowish type stones. But in this case, it is used to identify just a portion of the stone that is that color, or maybe a large spot on the stone itself. We do have a picture to take a look at. I do not have a stone that I would call Kiiro or that has a Kiiro attribute. So in this case, Shinichi once again has given us a picture to take a look at. Here we can see that the larger portion of the stone is going to be a gray color. You might call that Karasu, but I probably would just say it's like a patterned Asagi. But we do see that it has these large splotches running through the stone on the surface that are Kiiro. Now, interestingly, if we look at the rest of the stone on the sides, there's a chance that maybe this stone becomes a Kiita or a Tamagoiro as we work through what is remaining of this gray layer. But in this case, usually we identify the stone based on the sharpening surface. This sharpening surface is not majority tan. It still has that mostly gray color. It's going to slurry gray or bluish gray, and as such, the white spots are called Kiiro at this time at least. Our next visual attribute is called Masame. Here's the kanji for it, and this means roughly straight grain. When we're looking at a stone with Masame, it is where the Gotogi, the natural stratification or layering of the sedimentary rock, is not on the side of the whetstone like most stones have, but instead is on the sharpening surface or face of the whetstone. This does not necessarily have a negative impact on the performance of the stone. Usually the layers are homogeneous enough that the stone still feels consistent, but it is more about how the stone was cut and the look of the stone itself. In this case, we do have a Masame stone to look at in person, so we'll switch over to the video, take a look at that, and then come back to the presentation afterwards. Our example for Masame. Now, once again, we're not talking about the base coloring. This is the layering in the stone itself. And this is usually what you see on the side of the stone as Gotogi. Usually it's this way, and then you would cut the stone like this. But in this case, the layering was cut to be the surface of the stone. And when we can see that layering on the surface, we call it Masame. The next term we're going to take a look at here is called Mokume. Here's our kanji for it, and the meaning is wood grain. So once again, we're looking at another type of grain or wood or layered type visual property. For the information on this, it's referring to grain found in wood per the meaning of it. Again, it can get a little mixed up with kan or Nenrin Hada, or Mokume, or not Mokume, I'm sorry, Masame, we just covered it. So when we're trying to determine what is Mokume versus these other options, there's going to be less layering running across the stone, either vertically, horizontally, or diagonally, and it will be more of the actual wood pattern within the stone. The difference, though, between Mokume and Nenrin Hada is that Mokume will not complete the circle. So it will not look like the full chopped in half log. It will look more like you would think of in like a stylized kitchen table or something, right? Where you see the wood grain and it makes the pattern, and maybe even it makes part of a knot or a circle, but it's not the full chunk of log, if you want to call it that way. So we do have a Mokume stone to take a look at in person. So we'll switch over to the video and take a look at that real quick. We only have one example for Mokume. This is what it looks like. So this is, again, similar to kan, where it has the wood grain properties to it. But unlike kan, where it's running across the stone, we can see the partial circle of it. And unlike Nenrin Hada, we cannot see the full circle of our fake log or whatever wood grain. So in this case, we consider this Mokume. I'll be real careful when I wet this because this stone is not sealed yet. You'll see it again on the cashew lacquer sealing video. But here's what we're working with. This one in particular looks really like wood because of its coloring. Our next visual attribute to take a look at here is called Namazu. The kanji for this is here, and the meaning is roughly catfish. So for the information of this, it's not always referencing the traditional catfish. It's actually referencing Namazu, which is a giant catfish in Japanese mythology, which is responsible for earthquakes, which is kind of an interesting background to the name. When we use it in Whetstones, though, it's indicating a certain quality where light tan, even sometimes pretty white, spots or lines are running in the stone or throughout the stone in a non-uniform shape. So it's not making a particular pattern. They could be running across it or in blobs within the stone, but they're definitively different. You know, they're not affecting the slurry color. And sometimes they will also run along hairline inclusions. Sometimes you'll see hairline inclusions that have Namazu on the outside of it. So I have a few stones that do have Namazu properties. We'll take a look at those in the video and then come back to our presentation. For our example of Namazu, it's actually a stone that we've seen before, but rather than looking at the side, we're going to look at the surface, and these are these white blotches on the stone, which represents or looks similar to the Japanese catfish. So we're not talking about this base color here, we're talking about the blotches. Very frequently these will also be lines. I suppose I do have another stone with very light Namazu, which is this. And these white colored lines, or the lines that have white coloring around them, would all be also classified as Namazu. So we are now on to our last visual attribute that looks anything like wood or wood grain, which is Nenrin Hada. Here's the kanji for it, and the meaning of it is ring skin. So when we're talking about Nenrin Hada, it is used to refer to a stone that has what looks like the growth rings of a log or a tree. Now, that seems like the same definition as Mokume, and it seems like the same definition as kan. But there are differences between all of them, and in this case, we're looking for the entire circle of the log or tree to be present. So unlike kan, where the lines are running just across the stone itself, it's not going to have a very visual wood pattern. You're just seeing the individual lines. And unlike Mokume, where it looks more like stylized wood, like you would see in like a wood handle or wood furniture, Nenrin Hada looks more like you just chopped a log in half or chopped a tree trunk and looked at the growth rings. Hopefully it gives you an idea of what each of those look like differently, and obviously it is easy to confuse them, and nobody's going to get too upset if you accidentally call a Nenrin Hada stone a Mokume or a kan stone Nenrin Hada. They will probably understand what you're talking about, but if we're trying to use the terms as clearly as possible, those are the different attributes they're referring to. In this case, we do not have a Nenrin Hada stone, so Shinichi once again has come to the rescue with a picture. We'll take a look at that now. You can see compared to the other stones that we have the clear center with growth rings, look of the growth rings coming out from it, and it looks not like a knot in wood, but you see the clear rings coming out. So we know it's not kan because the rings are not just running across the stone in one direction, and that's it. We know it's not Mokume because the whole circle is present of the bisected tree or log, if you want to call it that. So after that, our next visual, or in this case, physical attribute to cover is su. Here's the kanji for it, and it means nest. So when we're talking about su, it's actually referring to the small holes that are present in the actual formation of the stone itself. So while we can see the holes, it's not just a coloring like some other items, it is a physical alteration of the stone. Now, su holes were formed when during the metamorphic process, right, a stone is formed by sedimentary runoff from marine plankton life, from clay-like stone, or from volcanic runoff. Those are formed into layers, and then they are pressed and heated by geothermal activity over time. When that is happening, there's of course moisture in the soil or pockets of water that can form under that stone. When the stone is pressed and heated, that water is formed into steam, and it will escape through the sedimentary layers above it. So a stone that has su in it, had that steam escaping out of the stone when the stone was functionally being baked by the metamorphic process. And in this case, it was baked enough that the stone never closed up those holes when all of that water or liquid was boiled away. So we can actually look into the surface of the stone itself. Some have very big su holes, others have small su holes, but there will be holes dotted within the surface of the stone. This is most commonly found in Suida stones, which are named after the su holes, Suida, but you can find su holes in other strata, such as Tomai or Senmai, are also two other strata which can have it. I wouldn't say frequently, but maybe if 80% of all stones with su are Suida, the other 20% might be those. So if you have a stone with su in it, whether it is a Suida or otherwise, extra care should be taken when you're using what's called a Nagara progression. A Nagara progression, of course, is where you start with a coarser rubbing stone to generate slurry, and then you go up to a very fine or tomo rubbing stone to generate your slurry, and you work the blade in a progression of fineness from coarse to fine. So if you have a stone with su, though, it means that your sharpening surface, the surface of the stone that you use, is not one consistent plane of flat material. It's actually a flat plane with little tiny holes, microscopically or not microscopically, within the surface of the stone. So this means when you use your coarser Nagara, there is a chance that some of the sediment from that coarser Nagara gets stuck within a su hole and lodged there. And over time, as you work your up through your Nagara progression, that coarser material stuck in the su hole could actually become dislodged and reestablish itself into your slurry, but at a finer stage in your process. So what that is likely to do is to create rogue scratches on your bevel. So whether you're polishing with Nagara or honing or sharpening with Nagara, whatever, you're using Nagara and you have a Suida stone or a stone with su holes, make sure that between each of your Nagara steps, you're taking extra time to really thoroughly wash out the surface of the stone, getting all the sediment out so that you do not accidentally have any of those leftover particles remaining. So I do have some stones with su. It can be a little bit hard to see because none of them have particularly large su holes, but I do believe they'll show up on camera. So let's take a look at those and then we'll be back to our presentation afterwards. For su, interestingly enough, the stone I have that classifies it, or rather shows it the best, is not a Suida stone, but su does not have to be just Suida. And what we're looking at here is this little hole. And we have another one there. Hole, and once I point them out, hopefully it becomes more apparent that there are holes all over the surface of the stone. We'll take a look at the Suida and see if we can find it. But this Suida is a very compact Suida, so the holes are hard to see. But if we look at the side, you can see that hole right there just fine. Those are very similar. I know under a loop you can find the holes, but I do not think we are going to be successful outside of looking at them from the side. So again, all these little holes that we see in the lacquering are su. And I do have a third strange example, which is Takashima stones. Takashima stones have very weird su holes. They are these ovals. And like Iwatani stones and other stones from that area, frequently the su holes are filled with non-toxic material that looks like this. And that does not, it's red. And it does not hurt the blade, it's not difficult to work on. but rather than being a hole that's empty, it usually is a hole filled with something. And Iwatani sweetest stones are that same way, usually. Our next visual property to take a look at is Sunashi. Here's the kanji for it, and the meaning is no nest. This is in fact related to Su. So there are 3 layers of Suida stone, and one of them lacks Su holes entirely. So since Suida is named after its Su holes, this is obviously a little abnormal compared to the rest of the stone pulled from that strata. In this case, when we talk about Sunashi Suida, it is just a Suida stone with none of the Su holes. It's just a solid piece of stone like the standard Tomai, Namito, Aiza. All those stones usually don't have Su holes. In this case, Sunashi is referencing specifically a Suida strata stone with no Su holes. These do have a reputation for being harder and sometimes a little finer than other Suida stones, but sometimes lacking the cutting speed that Suida is known for. If you do not get your Sunashi Suida from a reputable vendor, it's very difficult to tell if the stone actually is a Sunashi Suida stone or just another strata altogether, because you lack some of the fundamental attributes that usually are identifying a Suida stone. The easiest way to identify a Sunashi Suida stone would be a stone that has no Su holes but does have Renge. Renge is a type of inclusion that we will get into in a later portion of this video, but worth bringing up now for the identification of Sunashi Suida stones. I do have a Sunashi Suida stone, so we'll take a look at that in video and come back to our presentation afterwards. So Sunashi is an interesting visual quality because it's the absence of, whereas everything else is the presence of something. So in this case, we have a Iwatani Suida stone, but as you can see on its surface, hopefully, it has no holes. And if we look in the side, it also has no holes. If we look on the back, there are no holes in the lacquer, no dimples in the lacquer. So this is a Sunashi Suida because it lacks those Su holes when it probably should have them. Our next visual attribute to take a look at is called Tamamoku. Here we can find the kanji for it, and generally the meaning, if you literally translate it, is ball eye, but what it's actually referring to is the Tamamoku cedar, which is named Tamamoku, obviously, in Japanese, and has a very specific look to it that has little kind of different colored eyes or burrs within the wood itself. So these burls create a certain visual look within the wood, and there are whetstones that have that similar look or mimic it when we look at the surface of the stone. It's kind of hard to describe what this looks like without seeing it. Luckily, I do have a version. We'll look at the video, but trying to describe it, it has a flat base color. Usually like Asagi or Mizu Asagi are the most common color. So it's either gray or a blue gray. And then within the stone, there will be blotches or portions of it that are a lighter version of that color. And they're blended together. So we'll take a look at the video that will help us a lot get an idea of it. But before we get there, Tamamoku stones are generally considered to be a harder stone with very high levels of compression. That's what makes that look. I'm sure that there's an oddball example out there where it's a Tamamoku stone that's soft, but I have personally never run across one myself or one that anybody else has. So while yes, of course, you always have to check the stone itself, if a stone has Tamamoku qualities, there's a very high probability it's a harder and finer stone in the spectrum of things. So let's take a look at the video, then we'll come back to our presentation. Tamamoku, we have two examples of, both Mizu Asagi, which is not strange given that the stones are usually very hard. So if you look up Tamamoku cedar, it will give you the understanding of what you're looking for here. But there's this pattern of these light dots within the stone against the darker background that looks like a certain cedar wood, and that's what this is referring to. So here's our first one. This is very prevalent Tamamoku. And the second one, which is also a Mizu Asagi, has lesser Tamamoku, but it is still there. You can see it as the blotching here in the stone between the lighter and darker areas. Don't ignore the water. And actually, even this stone, our Asagi stone, does have it in this area, so hopefully I can get that to be seen. This one's a little harder to see, but you're looking for the difference in blotching in the gray area. And we are on to our last non-inclusion type of visual attribute for stones, which is called Yake. Yake, here's the kanji for it, and it means burnt in Japanese. So this can either refer to the entire whetstone itself, but usually is referring to different parts of the whetstone itself that are a deep orange color and obviously appear to have been burnt by fire. It's very common in certain types of sweetest stone. Okudo Suita has a particular reputation for having this Yake burnt color to it. So there are other types of stones that will have Yake. It doesn't necessarily mean that all stones with Yake are sweetest stones or are Kudo Suita. There are many that have it, and for instance, I have some Senmai stones that we'll take a look at that do have Yake as well. In rare cases, it is possible for Yake to be harder than the surrounding stone itself. So while we don't normally consider Yake a toxic inclusion, in very rare circumstances, it can be. So usually that comes as a very deep orange that almost looks like it's turning brown or black in its color transition. And in general, if you see very dark Yake, you should ask the vendor or person to just double check and make sure it's not scratchy or anything like that. Luckily though, a lot of that toxic form of Yake are on the very edge of stones where the Kawa begins, the stone skin, and as such usually can be avoided. But, if you're in doubt or an area looks particularly deep orange or concerning, just do your due diligence and make sure that they check. Obviously in this case we do have some stones with Yake in it, so we'll take a look at those and then return to our presentation. Yake is burnt, as covered in the slide. And how to tell if it's a burnt color is you gotta identify the base color. Slurring may help with that for these stones that have a very large property of Yake. But in this case, this is because it comes up as white or gray colored slurry. But we have this area where it looks like maybe it was burnt or toasted. And this one is more obvious that it is not a base color there. We have a large Asagi area with Yake on the sides. I do have a third stone here behind me that actually is the toxic form of Yake on it, right here. So it's this area, which maybe wet will become more prevalent. This area is much harder than the other areas around it. So if you were to use this, and this was more in a usable area, you would feel that Yake, and it would be the bad version of it, the toxic version. But that is also Yake, this tanning of the stone. So we're now on to our third group of visual qualities that Japanese whetstones can have, which are those of inclusions. Now, as I kind of said in the beginning of the video, an inclusion can be a safe inclusion or non-toxic inclusion, or a toxic or unsafe inclusion. We will cover both in this section, though I will cover all of the safe inclusions first, and then the two toxic inclusions that we talk about at the end. Once again, a toxic inclusion is unsafe or toxic to the blade, not the human itself. And as you can see, many of the visual qualities that we talk about in stones are actually a form of inclusion. Before we jump into them in particular, I suppose it's worthwhile just discussing what an inclusion is. And an inclusion is anything that is foreign matter that was inside of the, slurry mix that was then pressed and baked by the earth to create the stones that we use. That can be a plant matter that was in there. It can be functionally animal matter of some kind that is, not truly microscopic. Usually it's plant matter of some kind, though, and in certain forms it's plant matter. And then others, it will be the presence of minerals. Those minerals could have been there again from the sedimentary buildup, or it could have gotten there through water running through the stone or escaping through the stone during creation, evaporation, like kind of how sew holes are made. And when we consider something a safe inclusion, it means that it's either of equal hardness to the surrounding, regular whetstone, or it is softer than the surrounding whetstone, and as such it won't impede the performance. If it is toxic, it means that the inclusion is harder than the whetstone itself. So when you touch it with the blade, it wears, differently than the main stone, and usually they're made from larger particles than you want to be touching the blade with, or harder particles than you want to touch the blade with. Theoretically, you do have a chance that these inclusions can go from safe from non-toxic to toxic in certain circumstances. Generally speaking, though, that's pretty rare. And some of them are never going to be toxic, like Renge is never going to be a toxic inclusion. So you'll see I divide them into safe and unsafe, and that's usually a pretty solid delineation. But of course, when you're working with natural substances, you always have to test the stone. I know that sounds like I'm a broken record, but it is always the truth. For your own due diligence, make sure you're testing stones. So, okay, let's move on to our first type of inclusion here, which is Atarazuno Hari. Here's the kanji for it, and this roughly means needles without hitting. When we're using it in this context, it is referring to very thin black lines or dots that are present within the stone itself. It is possible for those lines to be reflective and still non-toxic. However, that is extremely rare. Usually, Atarazuno Hari is not reflective, and the toxic version, called Harike, is reflective. So if you do see a series of needle-like inclusions and they are reflective, you really got to test that out or have the vendor test it out before you assume it's okay to use. So I do have an Atarazuno Hari stone. We'll take a look at that in video and then come back to our presentation. We only have one example for our Atarazuno Hari. And there are obviously some different visual qualities to this stone. Particularly what we're looking at here are these hairline black lines that run in this area, and some of them run the length of the stone. The only way to tell if this is the toxic or the non-toxic version, which is Atarazuno Hari, or Arike, which is the toxic version, is to use the stone, though the fact that these are not reflective lines in the surface spell more likely that it is non-toxic variety like this. All right, our next type of safe inclusion to cover is called Enshou. Here's the kanji for it, and it roughly means firecrackers. So when we're talking about Enshou, it looks a lot like Renge, either blue Ao Renge or black Kiiro Renge. However, and they're formed via the same process, which are called dendritic formations. They're a type of mineral crystal within the stone. However, we use the term Enshou when we refer to this type of dendritic formation in non-Suida stones. So Renge is its own specific type of dendritic mineral formation inside of Suida stones only. It has a certain look to it, and if that is present, we know it's a Suida stone. Enshou looks similar, but it does have a different quality to it, and very frequently it's going to be, again, that it's going to be a black look as well. So Usually these are not toxic. I've been told by some people that there are toxic versions, but I've never seen an example. I think the likelihood that they're not going to cause you problems is in the 99% plus area, that you will be fine with any stone. And I would feel confident getting a stone with Enshou, the black spots, crystalline formations, without really requiring the vendor to, go in and touch every single one of them or something. So I do have some stones with Enshou. We'll take a look at those in the video and then come back to our presentation. We have two examples for Enshou, at least the two I've pulled out. Here we have an Igarashi with a lot of Enshou. Looking at the black dendritic formations in the stone. So in this case, this is not Renge, because it is not in a sweetest stone. So it is Enshou. One of my favorite visual qualities, and I really love the way that Igarashi looks. And then we have an Aizu here with some as well. You can see it under the lacquer. And if we look at the surface of the stone on this side, it has it as well. Very interesting visual inclusion. And those are non-toxic, obviously. The next inclusion for us to cover is called Goma. This is also a safe inclusion. Here's the kanji, and the meaning of this is sesame seeds. When we use it in the terms of whetstones, it is the presence of small little black dots throughout the stone's surface. Technically, when you look at them up close in a macro format or under a loop, they may not all just be dots. They could be like little tiny lines. They could be little blotches or round circles. But from, a non-magnified distance, they're going to all kind of look like dots within the stone's surface. Similar to Enshou, this is considered a non-toxic type of inclusion. There's only one example I know of that we could consider Goma to be semi-toxic, and I'm sure that there are fringe cases, in other stones, but I do know that in Asano, Mikawa, Komanagara, the black dotted variety, which is the more commonly found variety, can be considered toxic, toxic in the sense that it leaves more scratches than non-black dotted Koma would. So the performance is different. Granted, if you're not going to stop your polishing on a Koma, the little dots probably don't make that big of a difference. But if you are really doing something like a super high quality Hanyaki knife or something, there's a chance that the black dotted Koma could set you back. So I do know that one in particular as a specific example. Most Awasedo, though, with Goma are not going to have any form of problem. And I think the probability, again, 99% chance that an Awasedo with Goma has no problems at all. So I do have some stones with Goma for us to take a look at. We'll see those in video, and then we'll come back to our presentation. So I have multiple stones with Goma, but I picked out the one that I thought would be the easiest to see, because Goma is very small, so it can be difficult. More contrast really helps to get it on the camera. What we're looking at here is the small black dots in the surface of the stone. You can see this one has plenty of Goma, but does not affect the performance. So our next type of inclusion to talk about is called Kesuji. Here is the kanji for it, and it roughly means hair streak. These are hairline inclusions within the stone that usually look black or brown and are fairly thin. They might not be needle thin, but again, hair, so they're just a little thicker than the needle version. And they are not felt under the finger or blade. So if you rub your finger on the surface of the stone where the Kesuji is, where the line in the stone is, you should not feel it. And as you use the blade for sharpening or polishing, the line should never make itself present. This is not to be confused with Suji, which is a different look of non-toxic inclusion within the stone. A Kesuji line should be very thin, Again, looks like a thicker piece of hair of brown, probably brown or black hair on the surface of the stone, whereas Suji has a very particular other look. We'll cover that in just a few slides here. Now, one thing to note with Kesuji, even though it is non-toxic itself, it can pose a little bit of danger to stones, especially when you soak them in water. So some people will soak their whetstone in water for a period of time, especially if you're someone who's going to soak it for 30 minutes to hours, and some people will even soak it for days to try to soften the stone. Kesuji lines are still a mineral inclusion within the stone that is forming kind of like a seam through the homogeneous layer of sedimentary rock. So if that seam, whatever mineral it's made of, is softer, it's Kesuji, the non-toxic variety, but that mineral layer can still be more porous than the stone around it. It could be more absorbent than the rest of the whetstone around it. So there's always a chance that that is either letting water ingress into deeper portions of your stone, which may be not as structurally sound, or it may actually literally be swelling a little bit within the stone. And over time, obviously, water ingress in weird parts of the stone or a line swelling and retracting over and over again can crack the stone. So if you have a Kesuji line in your stone and it wraps around the side, you certainly want to seal the sides and the back of that stone. I generally suggest you do that for all stones, though. And if you have Kesuji lines on the top, do be a little bit more weary of soaking the stone for really long periods of time. A 5-minute soak just to get it initially hydrated is not going to cause a problem, but those more extended soaking cycles could cause an issue where a Kesuji line turns into a fault for the stone to crack upon. So do keep that in mind. Additionally, it is theoretically possible for a Kesuji line to start off as Kesuji, the non-toxic variety, and turn into Kanasuji, which is the toxic variety. This does not mean that the portion of the Kesuji on the sharpening surface is altering. What it means, though, is as you work through the material of the stone, right, as you use the stone and you wear off layers of the sedimentary rock deeper within the stone, there's a chance that the minerals built up differently. And as such, there's a chance that the line goes from softer than the stone around it to harder than the stone around it. That is not a super frequent occurrence, but it is something to note. And generally speaking, the more Kesuji lines that a stone has, even though the stone is not impacted by it, the lower quality the stone is considered for both A, the potential for the stone cracking or swelling in those areas, or B, the possibility, however low, that the Kesuji line could be Kanasuji later on in the stone. So the non-toxic line could become toxic at a deeper area of the stone that you can't see. So do keep that in mind when you're looking at stones with Kesuji. I have stones with Kesuji. We're going to take a look at some of them. Generally speaking, I've not had any problems with them, but it's a informed hobbyist situation where it's always good to go in with appropriate expectations so that if it cracks along that line or causes you issues later, you aren't surprised, and you entered into it with appropriate expectations. So let's switch over to the video. We'll take a look at some Kesuji, and we'll return to our presentation afterwards. So we have an example of Kesuji here. So the non-toxic variety of hairline inclusions. These will be thicker than Atarazuno Hari. They'll be less plentiful. So we're looking at this line here and this line here. Technically, it still could be reflective and be non-toxic, but usually if it's reflective, it's going to be Kanasuji, which is the toxic variety. But in this case, these are not felt under the blade. I can't feel them with my finger, and I do not feel them if I use it. And under a loop, you can actually see that these are colorations of the stone, rather than a mineral inclusion of the stone, which is usually what the toxic variety is. It's a mineral that has become embedded, or is a seam through the stone. Our next type of inclusion to cover is called Nashiji. Here's the kanji for it, and its meaning is pear-like or pear skin. When we talk about Nashiji, it is indicating small brown spots or marks on the stone's surface, and it is essentially a brown variant of Goma. They could be formed from different minerals, but when you look at it, it looks incredibly similar to Goma. Goma and Nashiji can exist on the same stone, though. It's not one or the other. They just are similar types of patterns that inclusions form on the stone, within the stone. These are, again, non-toxic, and this is almost always non-toxic. I know that technically Goma has a version that could be toxic in one type of stone. I've never heard that about Nashiji. I think it's always going to be safe. As always, those stones should always be tested. I do have some stones with Nashiji, so let's go ahead and take a look at those. All right, we have one example for Nashiji. I have a few stones with this, but I think this one does the best job of showing it. And so it's the only one we're going to look at. And this is going to be similar to Goma, but we're looking for the brown dots. And this one has a lot of Nashiji in it. Similar to Goma, almost never a problem. Our next type of visual inclusion to talk about is a safe inclusion called Renge. This is probably one of the most talked about, if not is the most talked about type of visual property in natural whetstones. Here's the kanji for it, and it means lotus flower. These are tiny frecklings within the stone itself, within the stone makeup itself, that can range in colors from red, orange, pink, purple, black, and blue, and anywhere in kind of that spectrum in between. When we talk about these certain colors, the black and blue variety do have their own designations: Kiiro Renge and Ao Renge. Obviously, relationally, Kiiro Renge is the black one, Ao Renge is the blue one. These are more rare, and the black version only comes from the Ohira mine. But many Suida stones can have a variety of these different colors, and you can usually find the red, orange, pink, and purples all present in the same stone. Much more rare to find the black and blue intermixed with those, but it is certainly possible. This visual attribute is not to be confused with Goma or Nashiji. Goma will be black dots rather than black flower petal freckles, and Nashiji is the same way. It'll be black dots rather than orange flower petal speckles. Nashiji is a little easier to not accidentally confuse when you're first learning because it is brown. There are not really brown Renge, they're orange. But Goma, in theory, could be confusing, but the minute you see a picture of the two, you'll never mistake them for one another again. These are all non-toxic. None of them will impact the performance of the stone. There are some wives' tales out there, if you want to call it that, about Renge impacting the performance of the stone. Some people say positively, some people say negatively, but there's generally very little evidence that stone to stone, the stone itself varies so much more than the Renge will impact it, if it does at all. Two other things to know about Renge is, one, it is only present on Suida strata stones. So if you're trying to identify your stone and it has Renge, it is 100% a Suida strata stone. Now, what Suida strata is it? That would be much harder to figure out. Renge will not tell you that, but it is one of the best identifying features if you're trying to determine strata. The second thing, of course, is that the more Renge a stone has, the more pretty it is, the more expensive it is going to be. Even though it does not necessarily perfect performance, it is definitely the most sought after visual quality of stones. Its coloring and the way that it looks can have like an autumn leaf blanket quality to it, and they are by far the most expensive visual attribute that can be added to the stone. So if you're someone who really wants to go for one of those stones that almost looks like Wagyu beef or something, where it has so much pink and white that it looks like beef, like that type of beef, it's going to be very difficult to find that type of stone, or it's going to be very expensive, one or the other. So I do have some stones with Renge in it. None are like Renge bombs, where they're just laced with a crazy amount of it. But I do have some that we can take a look at here. So we'll switch over to the video, and afterwards we'll return to our presentation. So we have 2 examples here to look at for Renge. We'll revisit this stone, which we already looked at. This one does have Renge in its surface. It has pink and orange Renge. And to tell the difference between Nashiji and Renge, you have to look at it closely or under a loop, but Nashiji will be dots like Goma versus Renge will be a pattern. It's kind of hard to explain, I suppose, but they maybe make like small little triangles or something, right? It's some form of semi-crystalline look. They're not crystals, but like Enshou, they're dendritic type formations. So we're looking here, we can see some pink, and then next to it is the orange Renge. We have a big pocket right here that's maybe easier to see on camera. And our second example of Renge is really easy to see. Sometimes people refer to this as Wagyu Renge, because it looks like very marbled Wagyu beef. And unfortunately this stone is riddled with toxic inclusions, but it's very pretty, at least right here. Maybe one day I'll make a Nagara out of it after these videos. So our next type of inclusion here to talk about, and arguably the one I have the worst time pronouncing, is Shiiki Uta-Gamori. I hope I said that right. But here's the kanji for it, and the meaning is clouds on the floor. I've also heard it translated as clouds on the ground. This is kind of similar to a Karasu pattern stone, but instead of having dark crow-like shapes behind a light sky, this is kind of the opposite, where usually you have a dark base color stone with cloud-like white blotches within the stone itself. This is far more common on sweetest stones. I'm sure it technically exists in other stones, but I have usually only ever seen it on sweetest stones. And it is also a little bit more of an attribute that will drive up the value or price, but nothing like Renge. So in this case, I used to have a stone that was Shiiki Uta-Gamori, but I no longer have it. So we can take a look at a picture here of it. I cannot show it to you in person. You can see, of course, it's pretty clear the white dots that are cloud-like blobs across the stone. In this case, there's a lot of it, so it kind of becomes more speckled. However, you can get versions that have a variety of different patterns. Our next type of inclusion, visual inclusion to look at, is called Tsuji. Here is the kanji for it, and the meaning roughly is muscle. This can sometimes be mistranslated as logic or streaks. So if you're translating, like auto-translating on Chrome, and it comes up as logic or streaks, there's a chance that it is a mistranslation of Tsuji, muscle. This is a visual quality, as well as part of the structure of the stone, that are brown lines that are running through the stone. These are usually formed by inclusions of plant matter within the stone. So while a lot of the other inclusions we've talked about are some form of mineral inclusion, usually Tsuji are plant matter, and sometimes even within the stone you can kind of make out what maybe it once was a stalk or a leaf or something like that. And they can usually be grouped together, and obviously it being plant matter, they're very frequently grouped together around layer lines. So if you look at the Gotogi on the side of a stone, you will see in particularly sweetest stones with Tsuji, brown Tsuji lines at each layer, because that's where the plant matter fell on top and then was covered and repeated throughout the stone's formation, sedimentary formation process. Tsuji can technically be unsafe, but almost all Tsuji is fine, especially when it's thin or sparse throughout the stone. Given that, though, it should still be tested before you jump into buying a stone with Tsuji and taking a look at it, either yourself or have the vendor test it and show you kind of as much proof as they can. Typically, the thicker the Suji line, the more likely it is to be a toxic version of Kesuji, or not Kesuji, of Suji, which would be Kanasuji. Once again, though, testing is necessary. Not all thick Suji lines are going to be of a toxic variety. I do have some stones with Suji lines, actually with a good variety. Some of them have little Suji lines, some of them have very thick Suji lines, so you can see the diverse range there, and all of those are non-toxic. So let's go to the video and take a look at that, and then we'll return to our presentation. All right, we have two examples for Suji. Here's our first example. And Suji are these orange lines that are running through the stone. In this case, it's very light. These are very light Suji lines. Nothing really to be concerned about, though Suida and Uchikamori without Suji is still considered typically higher quality just because these could pose an issue. Our second example here has very pronounced Suji. It was actually a concern when originally getting the stone, but they have turned out to not be a problem. So these are Suji as well. You can see they're that deep brown color and they're very thick. This stone has Suji running all through it, so we'll have to hope that none of that becomes a problem later. But it's unlikely given that these are fine. Our next visual quality to cover is called Sujimono. Here's the kanji for it, and it means muscle matter. This is obviously related to Suji, which we just covered. This term, though, refers to a stone with a very large amount of Suji present and running through the stone. Generally speaking, Sujimono stones are considered a little bit more undesirable due to the fact that Suji could be toxic, or it could be toxic deeper into the stone. Additionally, Suji, like Kesuji, can potentially swell or cause crack lines over time if you soak the stone. Suji in sparse quantities has a very low chance of that happening. Sujimono, though, where there's a lot of Suji lines, has a higher chance of that happening. So do be mindful if you like Sujimono stones, if you think they're cool looking and you want to get one. It could be fine, just test it and be weary of be weary of soaking the stone, which could lead to it cracking. In this case, I do not have a Sujimono stone, or one that I think qualifies, so Jonathan Gui has been nice enough to offer us a picture here to take a look at a Sujimono stone. And in this case, you can see it as a very Suji-filled stone. Though a lot of the lines are small, they still are all Suji lines. You can also see it running along the edge of the stone, along the different layers that have been formed. And this is a kind of quintessential, very heavy Sujimono stone that you'd have to check before you jump into buying it to make sure that all those lines are okay. In this case, it's fairly light-colored Sujimono, so we're probably going to be safe, but that is not something that you can always tell just because the brown is of a lighter variety, so keep that in mind. Our next type of inclusion, visual inclusion to cover here, which is of a non-toxic variety, is sumenagashi. Here are the kanji for it, and generally it means ink flow. These stones have a ink on marble effect, and are generally fairly sought after stones. They are usually Asagi stones, so grayish or tinted gray in color with black lines or black pooling ink flow on top of it. Sumenagashi traditionally is black ink on a white marbled surface. However, the actual term sumenagashi does not have to be black and it does not have to be on marble, so it could be realistically any colored look that appears to be ink flowing over a lighter surface. So usually, for instance, Keppan, which is, blood flow, which is the blood spots, but looks like flowing blood maybe on the top of the stone. If you have Keppan that's just a circle of a red dot, maybe it's not sumenagashi. But if you have Keppan, a blood spot that looks like flowing blood or pooling liquid on the stone, it will likely be both Keppan, because it's a red flowing blood look, and sumenagashi, because it also looks like ink on stone pooling together. So those can often go hand in hand. I do have an example. It will be exactly as we just discussed. It'll be a Keppan stone that is also Sumin Nagashi. So we'll go over to the video and take a look at that real quick. Keppan, I only have one example of. So mostly dry. It's going to be these red areas, which will come out a lot more when we wet it. Now, for the stone to be Keppan, the red areas need to have this this flow look to them, where it looks like they're pooling. So we're now on to our next type of visual inclusion, and this is the first of our two toxic version of inclusions. In this case, it's called Renge, and it means needle. For this particular type of inclusion, it is actually the toxic form of Atarazuno Hari. This means that the lines are very, very thin, again, needle-like lines, usually in patterns, but they can be one-off lines still. And in Renge, they're going to almost always be reflective lines. This is by far the rarer of the two toxic type of inclusions that one can have. Having a very tiny thin line, which is also toxic, is not super common. It is so uncommon, in fact, that I don't have an example of it, and I know nobody who has an example of it pictured. So in this case, you would be better off just looking at the Atarazuno Hari example and imagining that it's reflective and toxic. It is not the average variety. Most of the toxic inclusions are going to be not needle thick, but hair thick or greater. And as such, will fall into our next example here, Kanasuji. So Kanasuji means metal muscle. And this is going to be a usually reflective, but in this case, not always, hairline or muscle style Suji style toxic inclusion. So this could look like as thin as a piece of hair on the stone running through it. It could be up to what our Suji examples looked like, where it's those thicker brown lines running through the stone. Either of those fall into Kanasuji, and it is by far the most common form of toxic inclusion that we run into. In this case, whether it is the smaller or thicker black or brown version, they are mineral inclusions or some other inclusion that picked up minerals through flowing water, and those minerals, or even it could be sand, or it could be metal of some kind, are going to be harder. Whatever is in there is harder than the surrounding stone, and as such is usually going to be able to be felt under the finger if you rub your finger blade or your fingernail against it, or under a blade if you rub a blade over it. Now, one thing to note is that when you flatten out a stone for the first time, so when you lap it upon getting it, there's a good chance that you're using a diamond plate or sandpaper or, abrasive powder, diamond powder, stick powder, something to flatten out your stone and get it ready for use. Now, though the Kanasuji is going to be harder than the surrounding stone due to the mineral inclusion in it, it is still probably going to be softer than a diamond plate or stick powder. So with that said, there's a chance that with your stone, you will flatten out the Kanasuji, the toxic line, to the same level as the rest of the safe whetstone material. So you don't want to accidentally flatten it all out, test the line, and then go, well, I didn't feel the line under my finger at first, and I didn't feel the line under my blade at first, so everything is fine. Because in that sense, you're giving yourself a false sense of security, and it could be toxic, and when it rears its ugly head as a toxic inclusion, when you're sharpening or honing or polishing, you will not only void out all of your progress to that point, you may seriously damage the blade that you're working on. So the best way to usually check for them is to flatten out the stone still, and then condition the surface of the stone with a hard nagara of some kind. Softer nagara could work, you'll just be there for longer. And what this will do is it will wear at the regular, whetstone material within its composition at a different rate than it will wear at the toxic Kanasuji line. And what that will do is allow you, without, really using it, you can just test the blade a little bit or run your finger over it a little bit. After you've conditioned the surface heavily with a Nagara, that will allow you to test the line better. From there, you'll be able to tell, okay, I conditioned the surface heavily with a Nagara, I couldn't feel it, so it's either Kesuji, hairline inclusion, or Suji, muscle-like inclusion, which are both safe, or you will feel it. And if you feel that it's wearing at a different rate than the rest of the stone, it's a Kanasuji line. How toxic it is can vary. A barely toxic Suji line, which would then be still Kanasuji, may only show up after significant use of the stone. So if you flatten the stone out frequently, it doesn't cause an issue. It doesn't release any harmful slurry matter. Or a Kanasuji that's a hairline inclusion with sand or metal may be immediately toxic, and any use of it without addressing it will cause an issue. So you'll have to test it, try to push vendors to test for you or people trading to test for you and give you some proof. As always, though, it's always a little bit of a gamble. It's kind of difficult because if they test it and they don't find it or they don't test it well, may still end up with a stone that has Kanasuji. Now, if you do, the stone is not trash. Obviously, if you have, 20 Kanasuji lines running crisscross through the stone, you're probably not going to save it. But most stones with Kanasuji lines will have one or two in a certain area of the stone. And if you run into a stone like that, you can save it by digging out the Kanasuji line, that mineral hairline inclusion, or the Suji line. Sometimes people will refer to that as like a rust line. It's not rust, but it's the Suji line, the Kanasuji line, but looks like that brown Suji. So either you dig out whatever the inclusion, whatever the problem is with a nail, or I think people can use like a Dremel, or there's anything that's sharp and strong is good. Sharp, strong, and pointy is going to be able to probably get it out. So you can dig that out, and if it's fairly shallow, you can dig it out and then just sand the hard angled sides you made from the gully in the stone that you dug. If it's very deep in the stone, and you had to dig pretty far, maybe more than like 1/4 of an inch, or I don't know what 1/4 of an inch is in millimeters, but probably like anything more than 5 millimeters down, you're going to want to still sand it, but you may want to seal it. And you could use nail polish to seal it. You could use super glue to seal it, just create a layer. Super glue works pretty well because it quickly fragments and won't cause any issues with the slurry. Most lacquers and nail polish still don't cause much of a problem, but they could be a little harder than the stone material, so you'd have to sand it down as you get closer to the sealing material you used inside of that gully you created. But nonetheless, you can dig it out and treat it as is appropriate. If it's really thick, you just want to put something in there so that the stone doesn't have water pooling in a line in the stone, because then again you could lead towards swelling or cracking later in the stone's life. So if you have a Kanasuji stone, don't fret, you can probably fix it and still use the stone. So this stone, we'll revisit it again, does have Kanasuji. This thick line, even though you can't tell whether it is or not, is reflective. I don't think I can capture it underwater, and you will feel it on the blade. So this is a toxic hairline inclusion, and it makes the stone very difficult to use, of course, because it's in the middle of it. But the way you would test for this is, again, you'd run a blade, you'd look at it under a loop is possible. You could run your finger over it and you can feel it. Sometimes you can hear them, but in this case you can't, but I can feel that it catches. And then the most important thing to note about these, of course, is that when you flatten out the stone, sometimes they can feel flat. So you've got to use the stone a little bit, with a beater knife or something. You will feel that the line becomes raised faster than the surrounding stone, so it's harder, and thus going to be detrimental to the performance. So we've arrived at the end and covered all of the general terms you're going to find for Japanese natural whetstone visual properties. There could be other descriptors out there that I did not cover, but I think that this will give you almost everything you're going to run into and a real ability to look at the naming of a whetstone or a whetstone that has no name and be able to identify the different visual qualities it has, and also maybe see how much the vendor knows themselves, because if they're drastically mislabeling the stone, maybe that is a warning sign. So now, if you hear Nakayama, Tomai, Masame, Kiita, Nashiji, you're going to know that it is a Nakayama mine, Tomai strata, Masame, it's got the layering on top, so it's the Gotogi is on the top. Nashiji, it's got a pear-like quality to it, and I forget what I said. Kiita, it's yellow, right? Or Asagi, it's gray, etc. So I hope this has been helpful. It does help for you to like, subscribe, and comment if you want to see more of these videos. This was a larger undertaking than some of the other ones where I just pull a stone out, and I hope it has helped some of you. If you have any questions, please let me know in the comments below, and you can also find a link to a plethora of resources from naturalwhetstones.com also in the description of the video. So thanks for watching, and until next time.